This video is to give you a background on what constitutes protectionist policies that are enacted by governments to affect trade with partners outside of that country. And you might ask, well, why do they do that? Where does this come from? Well, this gives you an idea of what's led up to the most recent and most notable trade policy changes for the U.S. has had. And that is, if you go back and look before 1992, actually the trade, when we talk about trade surpluses and deficits, it is in relationship to, do we import more than we export? If we import more than we export, we have a deficit. If we export more than we import, we have a surplus. So, and it's not necessarily one in and of itself a good thing or a bad thing, but it's just a statement of fact. So in reality, we were at a slight trade surplus for a long time, and then around 1992, that changed to a trade deficit, and that trade deficit grew considerably over the next 10, 20 years. And a lot of people assume that has to do with the fact that we're buying more things from China and things are made in China, and that certainly is an impact. However, really what drove that was a trade agreement that was created back in the 90s called NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, and so that we really increased our trade with Canada and Mexico. It was actually pretty impactful right off the bat. And so that really created a large trade deficit. So, that the multinational agreements revolving around trade are intended to also influence the amount of trade that's done across borders, but in a positive way, typically. Okay, so you can see we've had a huge trade deficit form. Obviously, with China, it's grown a lot, but Mexico wasn't even on the list not too long ago, and now it's considerably larger than it used to be before, in Canada as well. By the way, in 2021, NAFTA was no longer in effect, and it immediately had an effect on our trade with Mexico and Canada. Both are actually lower. If I added those together, it would have been more than China, back about, let's say like 5 years ago. So that gives you an idea of what's going on. And then if we look at China specifically, the number of imports we've had are huge, coming from China going back to, we actually opened up trade with China back in the very early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And you can see it's grown considerably since then. So that's how things look. So our trade with China has actually gone up quite a bit. Now, when you consider this, one of the things to keep in mind is that it's not like the U.S. suffers for bringing in all these products from China. In fact, I would suggest if you go through your clothes drawer someday or in your closet and take a look at where things are made, and typically textiles had been made primarily in China, and now they're actually more and more coming from other countries as well. But nonetheless, there's a reason why you bought those clothes. I mean, they were less expensive, and it was actually to your benefit to do that. Walmart, as a retailer, has benefited tremendously from this. But obviously manufacturing has not. A lot of manufacturing that might have been done in the United States or in other countries is now being done in China, and that's had a direct effect on manufacturing jobs in this country as well. So we are definitely at a trade deficit with China. And part of the reason for that is China has protectionist policies on their end. They've always had a pretty substantial tariff policy towards their trade, people that trade with them. They're happy to ship stuff out, but they really don't want to bring a lot in. They want to produce it within China. So they've had a pretty stiff protectionist policies in place already, regardless of what happened after that. Okay, so that gives you a rough idea what has caused this thing. Now, when this happens, we have to take a look at the disruption in trade and what that does to the disruption in trade and other aspects as well. So one thing I wanted to show you was, and I think this is very interesting, and I saw this actually firsthand, back in the 2000, gosh, I'm trying to remember. I want to say it's 2008, but maybe it might have been after that. We had longshoremen, who are the people who actually unload container ships, which you see there's pictures of here. This is a large container ship that it come from China, Hong Kong, somewhere. And it's loaded up with a bunch of what looks like little boxes. Well, those little boxes are the things that are on the back of semi trucks that you see out on the street and on the highways. So these things are huge, and they're bringing in all kinds of products from there. The longshoremen went on strike. The people unloaded these boats, and there's only so many places that points of entry or ports of entry to the United States, and those are controlled by heavily unionized longshoremen. They went on strike, and it literally brought this trade to a halt. And there were ships sitting out there. I mean, I tried to get a picture that was indicative of what it looked like, but I got to tell you, when this was happening, it happened to me in California. I was looking out at it, and it kind of reminded me of the pictures you see of D-Day back in World War II, when the Allies were landing on France to actually take the war to the Germans on continental Europe, and there were just thousands of ships out there, and it looked a lot like this. It was just crazy. And somewhere out there was stuff that I was actually waiting for, which caught my interest. So it's amazing how much global trade has really affected how we do things. And then, so, there's different policies that governments put in place, but the main ones are they can have an outright embargo, and an embargo basically means they will not accept imports from another country at all. So we have that relationship today with Iran, and Iran conversely has that with us. We largely have that with Cuba. So there are certain countries that we have total trade embargoes with, and they obviously affect what our interactions are with those countries. And then there's the idea of putting in something called a tariff. A tariff is essentially a tax, if you will, on products that are being brought into a country. So, and I can give you an example. I exported things to India, for example, and I had as much as a 75% tariff put on the products that I was exporting to India. Meaning I made it in the United States and it cost $1. By the time the person who was going to sell it to the consumer got it, it was $1.75. Literally 75 cents of that $1.75 was going to the Indian government. So that's a pretty stiff tariff put in place. So what's happened recently now is that we've raised the tariffs, and this started back with the Trump administration, took a very aggressive stance towards China. Again, remember going back and looking at those trade deficit figures and how much China is contributing to that. Our relationship with China is contributing to that. That caused the Trump administration to put in a tariff, and significantly higher and higher tariffs as we've gone along. So basically, anything that we're bringing in from China has a much higher cost attached to it than it did before, literally because the government is charging this tax of bringing these products in from China. That affects certain people negatively, and it affects certain people positively. So in the discussion post now, what I want you to do is consider seriously what are the positive and negative effects of having these tariffs in place, who benefits from it, who's hurt by it, and answer in the context of the American economy and the American people, and the American society. Who is benefiting, who's hurting from that, presumably from taking those actions, and so you're gonna say pro or con that it was a good idea or bad idea. By the way, I don't want it to become political, and for one real simple reason is it's not. The Biden administration took over, and guess what? They didn't change the tariffs back. They've left them in place. So whatever we put in place, we still have in place. So it's not a party-driven political issue, and I really don't want to see that in the discussion post, because we got to be thinking about our economy and the American people. Okay, so that's your task. That concludes this segment of it. By the way, I have as a side note, and it's a really kind of interesting thing to look at. One of the more significant things that had happened in the United States from a protectionist trade policy standpoint is we, back in the early 1970s, for lots of reasons, the oil-producing countries that are banded together in something called OPEC decided to cut supply, in fact, create an embargo, and would not ship oil to the United States. Also, basically the Western world, I'm just going to say it like that. But the United States was directly affected by it, and it was pretty dramatic. So take a look at that, what goes into that. There's a little thing I put on the module. Essentially what happened was the price of gas shot through the roof. Now today we're paying a whole lot more than what we were paying back then, but imagine the price of gas going up. I mean, we're not even talking about it doubling to get to the price it is today. Back then it went up by 4 times. So, I mean, the impact was even more dramatic. And there were fuel shortages, which created an interesting situation where people lined up to get gas at gas stations. So it's a pretty crazy time. But look at that. Look at what happened with that particular action and what effect it had on our economy. A very significant one. That concludes this. Good luck with the discussions. I'm really looking forward to reading them, and get the quiz done on time, and you'll be in business.